The wind that day had teeth. It scraped across the open plains like a restless ghost, lifting the topsoil into thin ribbons of dust that shimmered against a pale, colorless sky. For weeks the sun had burned the land raw. Now the light was flat, as though the heavens themselves were holding their breath. From the porch of the Callahan ranch, Eli stood motionless, one hand resting on the worn post beside him. His hat brim was shadowed with grit, his shirt collar stiff with sweat and dust. He'd been watching the horizon out of old habit more than need. There hadn't been visitors in months. Then he saw her, a lone rider cutting through the haze, horse stumbling, figure slumped. The mare's gait was unsteady, the kind that spoke of long miles and no rest. The rider, a woman, swayed in the saddle, clutching something against her chest. Eli squinted against the glare, the shape of her blurring in the heat shimmer. By the time she reached the fence line, her horse nearly gave out. The woman dismounted awkwardly, one hand gripping the pommel for balance. Her dress was torn at the hem, once blue but now dulled by trail dust. Her hair, a tangled braid half undone, stuck to her neck in damp strands. Eli approached slowly, boots crunching on dry gravel. "You lost, ma'am?" he asked, voice even but wary. She looked up. Her eyes, pale as river glass, caught the fading light. For a heartbeat she didn't speak, then said softly, "I'm not lost, just looking for somewhere they don't know my name." There was something in the way she said it, a weariness that reached past exhaustion into something deeper. Eli nodded once, curtly. "Name's Callahan. You're standing on my land," she swallowed, eyes flicking toward the barn, the empty corral, the windmill creaking like a tired old sentinel. "Then I'll ask permission, Mr. Callahan, just for the night. I won't cause trouble." "Depends what kind of trouble you're running from," he said. Her fingers tightened around the small bundle she carried, a bundle wrapped in an old wool shawl. "The kind that don't stop chasing," she murmured. That answer settled like dust between them. Eli studied her a long while. There was something honest in the slump of her shoulders, in the tremor of her breath. He could have turned her away. Lord knew he'd turned away plenty of things since Mary died. But the sight of her horse, ribs showing beneath the coat, tipped the scales. He jerked his chin toward the barn. "You and your mare can bed down in there. There's water by the trough. I'll fetch you some stew when the hands are done eating." She nodded, barely whispering her thanks. The ranch hands noticed, of course. They always did. By supper, word had already spread that a stranger had come riding through the drought, a woman alone looking half dead. Some thought she was running from a husband. Others guessed bounty or blood. They watched her with a mix of curiosity and superstition, whispering behind their tin cups. Eli didn't join in. He ate his stew in silence, the way he had since the day the fever took his wife and unborn child 8 winters ago. Still, he felt the weight of the barn out back pressing at him. Later, when the lamps were low and the others turned in, Eli stepped out into the yard. The air hung heavy, expectant. Somewhere far off, thunder muttered like a warning. He hadn't seen rain in over 3 months, not since the last calf dropped. He found her there, sitting just inside the barn door, shawl around her shoulders, the mare resting nearby. Her bundle lay open now, not a child as he'd half feared, but a folded dress, white once, now the color of ash. A wedding dress. She was sewing at a tear near the hem, needle trembling between her fingers. "You'll catch cold sitting out here," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "I've caught worse. Storm's coming." Her needle stilled. "Maybe that's what I came for." He said nothing, only nodded and turned to leave. By the time he reached the porch, the first drops began to fall, fat, heavy, startling after so long without. They hit the dust and sizzled, darkening the earth in scattered blooms. Then the sky broke open. The rain came hard and wild, drumming on the roof, racing down the eaves in silver streams. Eli stood there a moment, letting it soak through his hat, through the ache in his chest that had been dry for years. Inside the barn, the woman, Clara, she'd said her name was Clara Sutton, curled up beneath the rafters, her head against the bundle of her shawl. Lightning flashed through the slats, tracing her profile in pale blue light. Eli could hear her faintly through the rain, soft, broken sobs that didn't belong to the storm. He almost turned away, almost convinced himself it wasn't his concern. But then came her whisper, carried on the wind between thunderclaps. "I'm trapped, rancher. Please save me." The words stopped him cold. He stood in the doorway, breath caught, the rain running down his face. She wasn't talking to him, not really. The voice was too far away, too lost in dreams or memory. Yet something in him shifted, quiet but deep, like the first crack of earth before the seed breaks through. He walked back to the porch, where the rocking chair still swayed slightly from his earlier watch. He sat down, the wood creaking beneath his weight. The storm raged on, cleansing, relentless, unmerciful, and for the first time in years. Eli Callahan didn't curse the sound. He listened. He listened to the rain washing the dust from his land, the thunder rolling over the hills, and the soft, aching voice of a stranger who'd come out of nowhere, carrying her sorrow like a scar. He didn't know yet what she was running from, but he knew, somehow, she had arrived exactly where the rain was meant to fall. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a silence that felt too large for the morning. The land steamed where the rain had touched it, thin mist rising from the earth like breath. The air smelled of wet cedar and smoke from the dying fire in the hearth. Eli woke before dawn, as he always did. The rhythm of a ranch didn't pause for sentiment. Fences still needed mending, stock still needed checking, and the sky still waited for men to rise beneath it. But that morning, when he stepped outside, something felt altered. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. The yard was slick with mud. The windmill groaned softly, its blades dripping. Near the porch, Clara Sutton stood barefoot, her skirt hitched up to the knees as she wrung out a wet blanket. The shawl around her shoulders was frayed, but she moved with a quiet purpose, her face pale against the morning light. "You don't need to be doing that," Eli said. She startled slightly, then lowered her eyes. "You let me stay. Least I can do is make myself useful." He studied her for a moment. Her hands were red from the cold, fingers trembling, but she kept working, shaking out the fabric with a kind of fragile stubbornness. It was the same look his wife once wore when fever first took her, that quiet defiance of the inevitable. He turned away before the thought could root too deep. "Suit yourself," he muttered, heading for the corral. The day moved slow. Clara swept the porch, mended an old shirt that had hung for months untouched, and washed the tin cups in the trough. She did it without being asked, without a word of complaint. The ranch hands watched her from a distance, curiosity turning to an awkward kind of respect. By noon, Eli found her near the barn again, crouched beside the old sorrel mare that had pulled up lame during the last cattle drive. The horse's flank was scarred from a barbed fence, and few dared handle her. But there was Clara, palm pressed gently against the mare's neck, whispering something under her breath. "She won't let most folks near," Eli said. Clara didn't look up. "She just needs someone to listen first." The mare snorted softly and lowered her head, nostrils flaring. Clara brushed her mane back with slow, deliberate strokes, as though she were smoothing out her own grief. Eli leaned against the post, arms folded. "You talk to animals?" "Sometimes they answer better than people," she replied, faint smile ghosting her lips. There was a long pause between them, the kind filled not with discomfort, but with understanding. Eli could sense the shape of her pain even if he didn't know the story yet. He'd seen enough widows and runaways to recognize the posture of someone trying to hold themselves together. It wasn't until the light began to fade that she finally spoke more than a few words. They were sitting by the trough, steam rising from their tin cups of coffee, the sky bruised with sunset. "My husband," she began, her voice soft as wind through dry grass. "His name was Jonah, died last winter. Fever took him fast." She stared into the cup, seeing something far beyond its rim. "He left debts, bad ones. I didn't know till after he passed. A man came to collect." Eli didn't interrupt. He'd learned the hard way that some stories only stayed together if no one tried to fix them. He said Jonah owed him land, money, favors. Things my husband never had. When I told him I couldn't pay, he said there were other ways. Called it settling the account. Her hands shook. She wrapped them tighter around the cup, knuckles white. I ran that night. Took what I could carry and rode west. I kept thinking maybe if I reached open country he couldn't find me. Eli's jaw tightened. What's his name? She hesitated, then whispered, Redden Pike. The name hit him like a hammer to the chest. He hadn't heard it in years, but he knew it well. A cattle baron who'd once tried to bleed Callahan Ranch dry through forged contracts and hired guns. Eli had stood against him once, barely survived it. He thought that chapter had been buried in dust and distance. He forced his voice to stay even. You're sure it was Pike? She nodded. His men wore his brand, the double spur. Eli stared into the darkening yard. The old rage stirred, quiet but deep, like a coiled snake waking after winter. But he hid it beneath his usual stillness. The years had taught him that anger was just another form of surrender, and he'd done enough surrendering for one lifetime. You won't see him here, he said finally. Clara looked at him, uncertain. You can't promise that. No, Eli said, rising from the rail. But I can make it likely. She didn't argue, only turned her gaze toward the fields, where the last of the light slipped behind the hills. The silence stretched between them again, filled with crickets and the low creak of the barn door in the wind. Later that night, Eli found her sitting by the fire inside the cabin, mending the tear in her wedding dress. She'd cleaned it earlier, laid it across a chair to dry. Now, beneath the firelight, it glowed faintly, not white, not clean, but softened, like memory seen through rain. He paused in the doorway, hat in hand. You planning to wear that again? She smiled faintly, not looking up. No, just patching what's left. Seems wrong to leave it broken. Eli nodded, though he didn't understand. Or maybe he did too well. They were both doing the same thing in their own ways, patching what was left. When he finally turned in for the night, the ranch was quiet, except for the wind. From his window, he could see her through the open cabin door, still by the fire, her hands moving slow, her lips forming soundless words. A lullaby, maybe, or a prayer for all the things she'd lost. Eli watched for a long while before blowing out his lamp. He didn't yet know if she'd brought trouble to his doorstep or deliverance. But in the flicker of her small firelight, he saw something he hadn't in years. Not peace. Not yet. Just proof that even after long silence, the heart still knows how to reach toward warmth. The next 2 days passed in uneasy quiet. The sky, heavy with clouds, seemed to wait for something. Thunder, reckoning, or both. Clara kept to her chores, though her eyes drifted often toward the road that wound past the cottonwoods. Eli noticed it. He noticed everything. That morning he rode into town for supplies. The place was small. One saloon, a blacksmith, and a general store that smelled of dust and linseed oil. It was near midday when the talk started at the counter. Fella came through early, the storekeeper said, weighing a bag of nails. Asked after a woman riding alone. Said she was his kin. Didn't sound like blood to me, though. Eli's hand stilled on the counter. What did he look like? Tall, wore a black coat, red dust on his boots. Had that mean kind of quiet about him. Paid in Pike coin, Eli's jaw set. He say where he was headed? The storekeeper shrugged. West, same way you came from. Eli didn't stay long after that. The ride back felt slower, the horizon darker. Clouds were building fast, a bruise spreading across the sky. The wind carried the scent of rain, sharp and metallic. By the time he reached the ranch, thunder rolled low and steady like wagon wheels over stone. Clara was outside, gathering sheets from the line. The wind whipped them around her like white ghosts. She looked up as he rode in, reading his face before he spoke. He's close, she said simply. Eli dismounted, boots sinking in the soft earth. You seen him? No, but I can feel him. I've felt it before. The air goes heavy like it does before a storm. The first drops fell then, fat and sudden. He grabbed the sheets from her hands and slung them over his shoulder. Inside, he said. By the time they reached the cabin, the storm had broken loose. Rain slammed against the roof, wind howling through every crack in the walls. The sky outside flashed white and purple, thunder cracking close enough to shake the floorboards. Clara stood near the hearth, arms wrapped around herself, shivering. Her dress clung to her, hair plastered to her cheeks. Eli tossed the wet sheets aside and lit another lamp, the flame trembling in the draught. "You'll catch cold," he muttered, pulling a blanket from the peg and handing it to her. She took it, hesitating. "Thank you." The words came small, like something she hadn't said in years. Eli crouched by the fire, feeding it more wood. The light painted his face in shades of gold and shadow, the face of a man carved by silence, by loss, by too many nights alone. When the thunder hit again, Clara flinched. He noticed the way her breath hitched, the way her fingers dug into the blanket. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, then shook her head. "I hate storms. Always have. They don't last," he said. Her laugh was bitter, soft. "Everything lasts if you remember it enough." The wind screamed down the chimney, scattering sparks. "Eli set a pot on the stove, filled it with water." "You might as well tell me," he said after a while. "What he's after. What you're running from exactly." Clara's eyes fixed on the fire. The flames flickered against her face, and for a moment she looked both older and younger, a woman carrying too much of both time and memory. "Redden Pike," she said finally. "He's the one that hunts me. Not for money, not anymore. For pride, for ownership. He said my husband's debt became mine when Jonah died. Said I was what was owed." Her voice trembled, but she didn't cry. "I told him I'd rather die than be owned. He said that could be arranged." Eli didn't move for a long time. The only sound was the rain hammering the roof, the slow boil of water on the stove. Then he stood and crossed to the corner, where his old rifle hung above the door. He took it down, checked the chamber, loaded each round with slow precision. The sound of metal clicking into place filled the room. Clara watched him. "You mean to kill him?" "I mean to stop him," Eli said. "How that ends depends on him." She wanted to protest, but the words died in her throat. The way he moved, calm, deliberate, told her he wasn't doing this out of anger. It was something quieter, older, a kind of duty he couldn't shake. The storm worsened. Water leaked through the roof, pooling on the floorboards. Eli found a tin bucket and set it beneath the drip. The fire hissed as rain found its way through the chimney. Clara sat near it, blanket drawn around her shoulders, eyes tracing his silhouette as he stood by the window. Lightning fled, and for an instant he was outlined against the glass, a tall, solitary figure framed in silver light, the rifle leaning against his leg. He looked like part of the land itself, built from the same silence, the same endurance. She felt her fear ease, not because she thought she was safe, but because for the first time in years, someone else carried the weight. "Eli," she said softly. He turned slightly. "If something happens, if he comes here, I don't want you to risk yourself." He didn't answer, just gave a small nod, eyes still on the storm outside. The wind roared louder. The lamp flickered, shadows crawling up the walls. Clara's eyelids grew heavy. She lay down near the fire, listening to the rain, the thunder, and the slow, steady rhythm of Eli's breathing. She hadn't slept without waking in terror since Jonah died. But that night, in the midst of storm and darkness, sleep came for her, deep and dreamless. Outside, the wind scoured the plains. Inside, Eli sat in the rocking chair, rifle across his knees, hat low over his eyes. The firelight moved over his boots, his hands, the old scars that marked them. He kept watch, not out of duty anymore, but because something wordless inside him demanded it. Near midnight, the storm began to fade. The thunder drifted farther west, and the rain softened to a whisper. Eli stood, stretched his back, and glanced at Clara sleeping by the fire. Her face was turned toward the glow, peaceful for the first time since she'd arrived. The blanket rose and fell with her slow breathing. He looked at her a long while. Not with longing, not yet, but with a kind of recognition. Two souls who'd weathered too much wind, too much loss, and somehow still found themselves under the same roof. He turned back to the window, where the last lightning flickered along the ridge. "Let it come," he murmured. "Whatever's left to come." And as dawn crept near, Eli Callahan kept his silent vigil, not out of promise, but out of choice. The days that followed the storm were quieter, though quiet didn't mean peace. The air hung thick with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, and the land, rinsed clean by rain, looked softer somehow, as though even the dust had grown weary of being cruel. Clara stayed on, though neither of them spoke about it. She moved through the cabin like a shadow made of light, washing, mending, cooking what little they had left in the pantry. The place had always felt too big for Eli alone, the silence in it like an extra ghost. Now, the small sound she made, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a tin cup, the soft hum of a tune while she worked, filled that emptiness in ways he didn't expect. He told himself it was just gratitude, that he let her stay because it was the right thing to do. But sometimes, when she'd hand him a plate or brush past him at the water pump, something inside him would tighten, a quiet ache. Neither welcome nor denied, he'd see her in the mornings, hair braided neat again, standing by the window with her coffee, watching the fog lift from the pasture. She never said much, and he didn't either. But something unspoken passed between them, a look, a pause too long, a shared stillness that neither dared name. It was easier to keep busy. Eli spent his hours riding the fence line, checking for breaks washed out by the storm. He'd find himself thinking about her, the way she spoke to the animals, the way she carried herself like someone who'd already lived 3 lifetimes of sorrow. He'd shake it off, muttering to himself, "You're too old for this kind of fool thinking." But the thought returned anyway. One afternoon, while he was mending a post, his foreman Will Crane rode up from town, face drawn tight. "Eli," he said, lowering his voice, "you best hear this. Red and Pike's been seen in Dust Creek, a couple of his riders with him. They're asking after you." Eli's hammer paused mid-swing. "How long ago?" "This morning. They said they'd be heading north." "That puts them this way by sundown if they mean to come." Eli's jaw worked. "Anyone talk to him?" "Not much. Folks in town keep their heads down when Pike's men show." Eli nodded once. "Reckon that's wise." When Will left, the air around the ranch seemed to change. The hands worked quieter, eyes flicking toward the hills now and again. Clara noticed it too. That evening, as Eli came in from the yard, she met him by the door. "It's him, isn't it?" she asked. He didn't answer, just hung his hat on the peg and set his gloves on the table. "Will told me," she pressed softly. "Red and Pike," Eli's eyes met hers. There was no use lying. "He's close." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, shadows crawling up the walls. Clara stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly, though her voice was calm. "You can't fight him, Eli. Not for me." "I'm not fighting for you," he said. "I'm fighting because men like him don't get to keep taking what ain't theirs." "I won't be the reason another grave gets dug," she said, tears brightening her eyes. "You don't owe me that." He looked away, jaw tight. "Maybe I do. Why?" she whispered. He turned the old knife in his hand, the one he'd carried since before he met his wife. The handle was worn smooth, the edge still clean, because I didn't save Mary when I had the chance. Fever took her before I could fetch the doctor. I keep thinking maybe I was just too proud to ask for help. Maybe this is how I make peace with that. Clara's breath caught. "Eli," he shook his head, "ain't about redemption. It's about not standing still while the same kind of men keep hurting the same kind of people." She reached for his arm, but he stepped away, crossing to the hearth. There, he took his rifle from the wall, wiped it clean, and began to oil it. The movements were slow, ritualistic, not anger, not panic, just preparation. The rain had left a coolness in the air, and the smell of gun oil mingled with the faint scent of coffee and smoke. Clara stood behind him, watching his hands. The light flickered against his face, tracing the hard lines time had carved there. "You're a stubborn man," she said softly. He half smiled. "You say that like it's news." Despite herself, she laughed, a small, startled sound, fragile but real. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and it hit him deeper than he expected. For a while they sat together, neither speaking, the rifle resting across his knees, the storm now only a memory whispering through the grass outside. When the lamp burned low, Clara stood to leave for the barn loft where she slept. But she hesitated in the doorway. "Eli?" He looked up. "If he comes, don't fight him for my sake. Just promise me you'll live through it." He didn't promise. He never did. But his eyes softened. just a flicker of something human breaking through the years of dust and silence. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow'll come soon enough," she nodded, though her face lingered in the lamplight a moment longer before she turned away. Outside, the wind had calmed, but the air still held the weight of coming reckoning. Eli sat long after she was gone, the chair creaking beneath him, the rifle gleaming faintly in the half-light. He thought of his wife, the way she used to hum over her stitching, the warmth that used to fill this same room. And then he thought of Clara, her courage hidden behind soft words, her will to survive sharper than any blade. He realized with quiet unease that what he felt now wasn't duty anymore. It wasn't obligation or guilt. It was something else, a need to protect what little good was left in the world, even if that good came in the form of a woman who'd lost nearly everything. When he finally rose to blow out the lamp, the room plunged into darkness, save for the faint red glow of the coals. Somewhere in the barn, the mare shifted. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and in that silence, Eli understood. Saving her might be the closest he'd ever come to saving himself. The sun went down like a slow bleed across the plains, turning the sky the color of rust and old wounds. Evening gathered heavy, pressing against the land. The cattle were restless, the dogs uneasy. Eli felt it in his bones, the kind of stillness that came before something broke. He stood on the porch, the rifle balanced in his hands, eyes tracing the horizon. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke long before he saw the riders. 3 of them, maybe 4. Torches flickered in their hands like pieces of the dying sun. Clara came to stand beside him, her shawl pulled tight against the rising wind. "They're here, aren't they?" He nodded once. "Stay inside." She didn't move. "You'll need someone to load." He looked at her, at the steadiness in her eyes. The fear was there, yes, but beneath it, something stronger. Resolve. Eli's voice came low, calm. "You ever fire a gun before?" "My father taught me when I was 12, she said. "Said the world don't forgive softness." He gave a single grim smile. "Then stay close." The riders came on slow, their torches swaying in the dark like ghost lights. At their head was Redden Pike, tall, raw-boned, with a scar that split his face like a map line. His voice carried when he called out, "Callahan! I come for what's mine." Eli stepped off the porch, the rifle steady. "Ain't a thing here that belongs to you, Pike," Redden grinned. "The woman does. Man, she owes in the ground, but the debt stands. You know how it works." Eli's thumb brushed the hammer of his rifle. "I know a vulture when I see one." A pause, long enough for the air to tighten, for every heartbeat to sound louder than the wind. Then, without warning, the world cracked open. The first shot came from Redden's man, a muzzle flash against the dusk. Eli dropped to one knee, returning fire. The crack of rifles split the silence, echoing across the dry hills. Glass shattered, the lamp by the window burst, flame licking up the wall. The horses screamed. Clara ducked behind the trough, hands trembling as she reloaded for him. The air stank of powder and burning oil. Eli's shoulder jerked as a bullet grazed him. He gritted his teeth, blood darkening his shirt. "Get back inside!" he shouted. "I won't!" she cried, thrusting the next cartridge into his hand. The fire from the broken lamp caught quick, crawling up the cabin wall, then leaping to the barn where the straw lay dry as kindling. The night turned to flame. Redden dismounted, striding through the smoke. "Ain't no use, Callahan. She's coming with me." Eli rose from behind the trough, rifle raised, but his arm failed him. The wound bled heavy now, and the rifle slipped from his grasp. Clara saw him falter. Something fierce lit in her chest. Not fear, but the sharp clarity that comes when there's no one left to save you but yourself. She turned toward the porch, where Eli's old revolver hung on a nail, the one he'd sworn never to touch again since the night his wife died in his arms. She took it down with both hands, the metal cold, almost sacred. Redden saw her silhouette against the firelight and laughed. A low, mean sound. "You think you'll pull that trigger, girl?" You couldn't shoot a man clean. Her braid had come undone again, hair wild around her face. She raised the revolver, arm steady. "You're wrong about that." For a moment, All sound seemed to stop. The fire's roar, the horses' panic, even the wind itself. Only the hammer's click and the breath between heartbeats. Then the shot rang out. Redin staggered, eyes wide, one hand pressed to the dark bloom spreading across his chest. He tried to speak, something half-formed, half-curse, but the words died before they reached his mouth. He fell face first into the dirt. The other riders fled into the darkness, torches scattering like startled stars. When the echoes faded, only the crackle of burning wood remained. Clara dropped the revolver and ran to Eli, who had slumped against the trough, pale but breathing. She tore a strip from her shawl, pressing it to his wound. "You stubborn fool," she whispered, tears cutting through the soot on her cheeks. He managed a weak grin. "Takes one to know one." They stayed there until the fire began to die, too exhausted to move, the world reduced to smoke and ember. When at last the sky paled at the edges, the barn was a blackened shell, the fields singed and silent, but the house still stood. Together they limped inside. The floorboards were scorched, the air heavy with ash. Clara eased Eli into the chair by the hearth, then sank beside him. "Let me see," she said softly, unbuttoning his torn shirt. The wound wasn't deep. The bullet had passed through the shoulder clean. "Still," he hissed as she cleaned it. "You did good," he murmured. "I did what I had to," she said, binding the cloth tight. He nodded, eyes half closed. "That's all any of us can do." Outside, dawn broke over the plains, pale gold over the charred earth. The smoke drifted low, curling around the fences like fog. Clara rose slowly and crossed to the window. Her reflection caught in the glass, face smudged with soot, hair tangled and wild. For a long moment she just looked at herself, then reached for her braid, weaving it back with deliberate care. Each twist of the hair was steady, patient, reclaiming something she thought had been lost. When she turned, Eli was watching her. "Rain'll come again soon," he said quietly. She nodded, her eyes tired but sure. "Maybe it already has." He smiled at that, the kind of smile that comes not from joy, but from peace hard-earned. Outside, a thin wind stirred the ashes, carrying them into the morning like snow, and for the first time in a long while, the Callahan ranch stood alive, scarred, blackened, but breathing. Fire had taken much from them both. But what it left behind, that quiet understanding, that small shared heartbeat between two broken souls, was something neither flame nor fear could ever touch again. Spring came slow that year, like an apology whispered through the wind. The snowmelt from the northern hills fed the dry gullies, and the land, long starved, began to green again. Shoots of grass pushed through ash, the cottonwoods along the creek wore new leaves, and the sky softened its color, no longer the harsh, unbroken blue of winter, but something gentler. Eli healed in his own stubborn way. The bullet wound knit itself under Clara's steady care, though the scar would remain. A pale reminder stretching over the shoulder like a memory he'd never outrun. He still rose before dawn, still worked the fences, though slower now. When the pain bit too deep, he'd rest in the rocking chair on the porch, a cup of coffee warming his hands, the steam rising into the chill air. From there, he'd watch her move through the yard, feeding the mare that survived the fire, hanging the wash, mending harness leather. She moved with quiet purpose, the kind that comes from building something back from ruin. The ranch had become theirs without either saying so. Some mornings, he'd find her humming softly, a tune without words, and he'd stop whatever he was doing just to listen. Other days they spoke of small things, fence lines, weather, the way the hills turned gold at dusk. But beneath it all, there was a knowing silence between them, like a prayer neither needed to speak. Still, a weight lingered in Clara's eyes, something unfinished. Eli noticed it the way a man notices the first hint of rain, quiet, inevitable. One evening after supper, she stood by the doorway, shawl folded over her arm. The lamplight painted her hair copper. "I need to go back," she said softly. He didn't ask where. He already knew. The small town east of the ridge, the debt left behind, the name she'd fled. He nodded once. "You sure?" She hesitated. "No, but I have to be." Eli looked down at his hands, calloused, rough, then back to her. "You don't owe me an explanation." Her voice broke a little. "I owe you more than I can pay." He met her eyes, steady and sure. "You don't owe me a damn thing." They stood in silence, the wind pushing softly against the window panes. Somewhere outside, a coyote called across the hills, distant, lonely. By morning, her mind was made. She saddled the mare just after sunrise. The grass was wet with dew, the horizon pale with early light. Eli came out to see her off, his hat low, the smell of coffee and smoke around him. "You be careful on the trail," he said quietly. "I will." He handed her a wrapped bundle, bread, jerky, a small pouch of coffee grounds. "For the road." "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a single nod. No plea, no promise. Just a man standing steady while something good rode away from him. She looked at him for a long moment, memorizing the shape of him in that dawn light, the scar at his temple, the faint gray in his beard, the stillness that felt more like strength than loneliness. Then she turned her horse toward the east and rode out. The road wound through the low hills, past the creek and the split cedar, past the last line of fence posts that marked the edge of his land. The air smelled of rain and new grass. Half a day later, she reached the ridge, the same place where months ago she'd first seen the Callahan ranch like a promise against the storm. She reined in her horse, breathing hard from the climb. From there, she could see the land stretching out before her. The burned barn now rebuilt in part, the house small but stubborn against the sweep of the plains. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and steady. Clara sat there a long while, wind tugging at her shawl. She thought of the man who'd given her shelter when no one else would, of the nights by the fire, the smell of rain after dust, the sound of his voice low and certain in the dark. Freedom had always been what she wanted most. But now, as she looked across the land that had nearly destroyed them both, she realized freedom wasn't always the leaving. Sometimes it was the staying, the quiet choice to stand still beside someone who'd learned the same hard lessons. The horse shifted beneath her. She turned the reins in her hands, hesitating only a heartbeat longer, before pulling the bit and turning back west. By the time she reached the yard, the sun was setting, all gold and rose behind the hills. Eli was on the porch, same as always, a tin cup in one hand, steam rising from it. He didn't look surprised to see her. She dismounted slowly, the sound of boots on dust the only noise between them. "Thought you had some reckoning to do," he said finally. "I did," she answered. "And I did it," he nodded, eyes steady. "And?" she smiled, small, tired, but real. "And I figured home's where you stop running." He didn't speak, just gestured to the empty chair beside him. She walked up the steps, sat down, and let out a long breath. The boards creaked beneath them. The wind moved through the fields, soft and endless. For a while, neither spoke. Then Eli poured the last of the coffee into her cup and said, "Suppose the rains'll come strong this year." Clara nodded. "They already have." The sky deepened to violet, the first stars showing faint above the horizon. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, gentle, distant. Not a threat, but a promise. They sat there as the night folded around them, two souls scarred and mended, sharing the quiet that comes after the storm. No vows, no grand words, just the slow rhythm of breathing, the soft hum of wind through the grass, the peace of having nowhere left to run. In the window behind them, the lamplight flickered against the glass. Two shapes side by side, steady, unhurried, alive. And when dawn came again, spilling gold over the greening land, the Callahan ranch stood as it always had, weathered, wounded, and whole.